So we'll jump into where we left off, and we're going to get started on the bottle just because it is, oh, I mean, it doesn't really matter which one we get started on. It's the same process, UV mapping. So let's just hide our can for the time being and get our bottle back to the origin. So we've got our bottle here in the middle of the scene, all cool. We don't need to worry about the liquid inside or the cap or any of that extra stuff. We're going to get around to covering all of that when the time comes. One thing I do notice real quick is the inside of my bottle is kind of jank looking, so I'm going to investigate this temporarily. So I just turn the lathe off, and the weird crazy part, as I go back in here and turn this back on, we've got these crazy polygons on display here, which will probably show up because this is going to wind up being a glass material. You'll probably see these. So if you have one of these either on the top or the bottom of your object, what you'll want to do is you'll want to select that point. So if it's like that point over there or this point over here, it's most likely going to show itself in the middle of your object. So with this point selected, I can see that on this axis here, which is kind of from left to right right now, the blue axis, which is Z, I can see down here on my coordinates I have a value that is not 0, which means that this one little point here is not centered. See, we can see this is 0.12 centimeters. So if I zero this out and hit enter on my keyboard, you'll see that that jumped into place. What was happening was it was almost as if it was nudged over ever so slightly, and it's kind of like intersecting with itself and getting all wild. The opposite of that might sort of manifest itself as a hole. If you're looking through this, you can see there's now a hole in the bottom of my bottle. So it could, that little error could show up in one of two ways. So if you have that, you're going to want to make sure that this X or Z value, whatever one's messed up, you zero it back out. So let me just do that real quick, and we'll get back on track. So UV mapping, what that is isolating, in this case, a section of our bottle, if I turn my line mode on, of where I would want to apply a label. And now it would most likely be this tall center section on a bottle, possibly additionally maybe a little stripe up here. So if I just look up just a reference on Google, just so that we can see, if we just look up like some craft beers. So what I'm talking about is this colored section where, you know, the manufacturer, the distributor, you know, they put their brand logo and all that fun stuff. So let's work this out. So in my case, my bottle is shaped a little bit more like this, where it's tall and pretty lengthy. And it's not necessarily that important that we have any geometry that matches, kind of like if we have like a curvature here. We just want to focus on kind of like that whole strip. So in order to do that, I have to make my bottle, I have to make it editable. So I don't want to delete my original copy, I want to make a copy. Bottle copy. And this one I can make editable by hitting C. So this way we can work with our polygons actually. So I'm going to hide that original one just by turning its traffic lights off, and this way I can focus on just this one isolated bottle, which is cool. So UV mapping, I keep saying it. What is it? What does it mean? How do we see it? Well, let's explore. So I want to change my layout here in the top right to this one, which is BP UV Edit, which is at least for me, it's the third one in the menu. So I'm going to switch to that, and we'll see that the interface changed a whole bunch. We still have our viewport and a lot of our tools and stuff, but some of the Some of the tools along the top and sidebar are now looking a little different. We have our objects list now down in the bottom left, which is kind of the opposite of what we're used to. And then we have this attributes in the bottom middle, and another kind of attribute menu specific to the UV mapping tools over here on the right. This is where we are going to be working quite a bit. And then lastly, there's kind of like a second viewport up here on the right, and this is going to be our UV. I don't know what the name of this exact menu is called, but I just call it the UV viewport. I'm sure it might have a specific name, but I don't actually know how to check. Anyway, on this bottle copy that I've made editable, we have this little checkered tag here, which is called a UVW tag. And we've seen these before. These have been present in every scene you've worked on up to this point, just you've probably never needed to interact with it. So what we want to do is we want to click and drag that tag up to the UV viewport over here, and that'll load in this image, or not an image necessarily, but it's going to load in the UV data of the object from that has that tag into the UV viewport. Now, we're not actually able to see really what this means, just because, you know, this is unfamiliar territory to us. So real quick, I'm going to make a new material, and you don't necessarily have to if you're just kind of watching along. This will just be for demonstration. So in this material, I'm just going to call it checker. And here on the texture little arrow, I'm going to go down to surfaces, checkerboard. And when I click to go into that checkerboard, I'm going to change the frequency from 1 by 1 to like 10 by 10, just so that I've got a lot of checkers. Just because this is going to make it easier to demonstrate to you guys. So I'll apply that to my bottle. And what I've done is I've applied a white and black checkerboard to my bottle. Not a logo, but this is going to demonstrate what is going on to us. So we can see here this checkerboard is a uniform kind of width and height, right? They're squared shaped checkers. They're not rectangles. They're not stretched horizontally or vertically. I mean here on the right in the material preview. But on the bottle, we're seeing that they are being distorted. They're now being either stretched vertically or they're being squished left and right. It's kind of hard to tell. But the result is clearly not checkers, right? I think we can all agree that these are not nice and neat checkers. So what do we do? Well, to demonstrate what's going on, if I just kind of drag that out of the way, and if I select my UV polygons, which is this polygon selection, not that one. So these three are the ones that we're used to working in, polygons, edges, and points. We're used to them being on the left over here, but now they're on the top. So if I select all of these, if I just select the whole object, we're going to see that all of the UV polygons over here on the right are selected. And if I use my scale tool, I can scale this to be really big, and we'll see that the checkers are getting smaller. Or I can scale it to be really tiny, and we see that the checkers are getting bigger. It's kind of like working inverted. But what I want to point out is on the scale tool, we're actually in the uniform scale. We want to be in the non-uniform scale. So if you click and hold on that, you can now, if I undo that, we can now scale either up and down or left and right, and we can see that we're now able to, over here on the right with our mouse, we can click and scale, and then if we watch on the left, we can see what's happening. We can kind of see this effect that we are having on our object. So this looks a little bit more square. Now it's not kind of an exact science, at least with cinema. The UV tools are kind of a little frustrating. If you move on to the advanced MACA classes, you'll be quickly familiar with a more powerful set of tools, but this gets the job done for simple stuff like a bottle. But what I want to point out is there's a lot of work, not a lot of work, but there's a bit of work that we have to do for UV mapping this bottle, but we can save ourselves some of that effort by figuring out what portion of the bottle we need to UV map, because I want to demonstrate to us, or to the class, that we don't need to UV map this entire bottle. We're only putting the label on certain sections, right? If I hold up my water bottle here, I only need to UV map, in this case, this very thin portion of the bottle. I don't need to do anything down here or anything up here, right? Does that kind of make sense? I only need to worry about the portions of the bottle that I want to attach a label to. Here on this Google image, you would have kind of two sections to work on if you wanted this upper and this lower label, but in my case, that's not necessary. I'm just going to focus on this center large section of the bottle. So if we jump out of that, and I just use my space bar, what I want to do is I want to select just these UV polygons in the middle of the bottle, which is kind of this large center area, which is where I would place a label. Right? I don't need to worry about any of this junk up here, and actually I don't need to worry about anything on the inside of the bottle. It's super important that we actually don't UV map the inside of the bottle, because when we turn this into a glass looking material, we only want the label on the outside. We don't want to apply a label using the UV mapping tools. We don't want a label on the inside and a label on the outside, right? Because the label is, physically the label is only applied to the outside of the bottle, so that's the way that we want to think. So with just this strip of the bottle selected, we can see over here on the UV viewport that only this portion right here is selected. Everything else is still black. So what that's telling us is this section of my polygons right here is what I need to worry about. Everything else I can kind of throw away. Or not throw away, but you know, I can kind of tuck that away and kind of stash it in the corner, and I don't need to worry about it. So what I can do is to select everything else, because I need to move everything else out of the way, right? All these UV polygons that are black right here, I could go through and just select all these, or I could invert my selection, right? I think we did this trick before on a different selection, or on a different model. I can just hit U on my keyboard and go to invert. So instead of selecting all of the parts of the bottle except for the label, I can just, you know, flip my selection. So with all of these now, I can scale them to be teeny tiny using my scale tool. So really, like, you can make these the size of an ant. It's not going to hurt it. And then using my move tool, I can just click and drag them kind of all the way down into the corner here. Now, cool, we can see it on the projector. There is sort of a darker gray portion of this box. We want to make sure everything stays within this box. Everything that's going to be the label, and even this little junk that we're kind of hiding in the corner, we don't want it to go outside of the bounds of this box. Now it doesn't need to be, you know, exactly, you know, pixel perfect to the corner. So you can just kind of give it a little bit of space, but, you know, kind of tuck it away. No big deal, it's not going to hurt it. And now I can just use my space bar here to select these. I can kind of click them, whatever, or I can just click and drag, kind of paint my mouse to select those. So that's cool. That's going to make my life a little bit easier now. We're almost done here as far as the UV mapping goes. What I want to point out is, if you think of this gray portion here as your Photoshop canvas, right? Eventually at some point we're going to work on creating a label or finding a label offline if we're recreating a product or whatever. We want to, you know, use our whole canvas in Photoshop. It's very rare that you make a Photoshop file and then, like, you only work on one tiny little corner of it, right? Or like half of it. It's just kind of an inefficient use of space. So I kind of want to blow this up so that it's using my space a little bit more efficiently. And I can kind of fit it to size. Again, I want to stay within the bounds here. So cool, that looks pretty decent. These checkers look relatively square. pretty dang even. I'm at least happy enough with it as is. So the last step here, as far as the UV mapping goes, is I need to save this here out as an image, so that way I can then take this into Photoshop and complete the next step. So how do we do that? Well, it's a fun little process, and basically every time I do it, I need to relearn it. So we want to click File here at the top of the UV viewport and select New Texture. So here I'm just going to call this bottle UV, because this is going to save a file on my computer and I want it to be something coherent that I can find. And the width and height here of 1024 is alright, but I think we can double it and use a 2K texture. So I'm going to type in 2048 by 2048, and I can make the color black. That's a handy thing to do there. So then I'll select OK. So this made this UV viewport black, and I want to make sure that I don't click anything over here. I don't select. I don't like move my camera or anything. We want to kind of just do this all in one shot. So I clicked File, I made my new texture, blah blah blah, got all that set up. Now I want to select Layer, Create UV Mesh Layer, and we can see that this made a couple weird white lines here. Yours is most likely going to look different. You know, it's just these white lines are just a matter of the computer kind of anti-aliasing this. So if we zoom in, it's going to kind of look all funky. But basically, what it did is it traced. It traced this sort of or what was a gray outline and turned it into a white and black image. So now we just want to save. So save texture. And it's going to say, okay, what format? And it's going to ask me where I want to save it. So I want to make sure that I bring this to the right folder. So assignment 3. And I'll make a text folder. So in text, save this out as bottle UV. Cool. So now I can open Photoshop. And who knows how long this will take. I'm going to go find that file on my hard drive. Awesome. So this looks pretty good. Pretty happy with this. I just need to find my layers. Oh, they're on another monitor. Cool. Those should be right there. So here in my Photoshop layers menu, I have two layers, the black background and this white thin UV mesh layer, which is sweet. So what I want to do now is when I'm designing or finding on Google, whatever my image, texture, label, whatever, I want to make sure that I fit that image within this boundary that I've made for myself. So before we jumped into the lecture, I looked up a logo, and I'm doing the soda slurm from Futurama. So I want to make sure that I save out this texture. Feel free to get creative, have fun, find something cool or interesting, or even make something cool or interesting for yourself if you'd like. So we'll save that out, and I know that the background is either blue or purple, kind of depends on where it's being shown. So I'm going to, I think this one looks pretty good. So I'm going to save this image as well, so that way I can kind of color pick what this blue background's going to look like. That's an awesome tagline. So we'll get that out of the way. and I'm going to open up in Photoshop now. I'm going to open up those images, or file place, or import, whatever. However you like to work Photoshop, that's your call. So if I open these up as separate images, which is usually how I do it, I'm going to duplicate that layer and I'm going to send it over to the bottle UV project and do that same thing over here. So right click, duplicate layer, send that over to the bottle UV file. So over here on this tab I now have a couple extra layers. So I'm going to call this one color reference, and I'm going to color pick one of these blues. So I'll grab my eyedropper and kind of go for one of these blue colors in the middle here. And I'm going to make myself a new layer and hit Alt Delete or Control Delete to fill. So cool, that's going to be my blue background. And then this Slurm logo, I now want to edit it a little bit, or not edit it, but just sort of scale and position it. So I'm going to shrink this down a bit so that's horizontally it fits within my boundaries that I've made for myself, and just kind of see what this is going to give me. And my arrow keys are not, there we go, now they're working. So accept that. So I think I'm ready to save this out, or at least I'm not telling you something because I kind of want to, I want to see what the computer's going to do, because I've got a hunch that the computer's tricking me, and I kind of want to demonstrate that. So the last thing I do before I save this out and try to apply it to my bottle is I want to turn off this UV mesh layer, because otherwise I'm going to be saving out a grid of white lines that's going to cover up my image. And obviously this awesome logo doesn't have a grid of white lines over it. So I'm going to save, first I'm going to save this as a PSD. So I'm going to call this bottle Slurm logo. This way I've got my PSD, my Photoshop file that I can come back and edit. If I come back and now all of a sudden I want to change the background to purple, I can do that. So now I'm going to try to save it out just as a PNG or a JPEG, whatever floats your boat. Cool. So let's just try this. I'll jump back to Cinema. And now here I'm going to make a new material. So this one's going to be called bottle logo. And in my color channel, I'm going to go load that there texture that I've just made for myself. So this one, the bottle Slurm logo. Hit OK. So this is looking all right so far. I might have been off on my hunch, but we'll see. So I will apply now. I want to apply this logo or this material to only the section of the bottle that I want the logo to be on. That's pretty important. I want to make sure with this object selected, I want to go into my polygon selection and I want to select just these polygons. So this is where my logo is going to be. This is the only section that I want to apply my logo to. So here in the material tab, I want to drag the Slurm logo material to just this portion that has the checkers on it currently. And we'll see that it's in here and it's on my bottle, which is cool, but it's sideways. See? I've done this once or twice. I knew that this was going to happen. So what the heck? Why? Just why? Well, life's not easy. And actually, because we were using that checker texture, if you think about it, how do you tell if a checkerboard is facing up and down or left and right? You really can't. So that's kind of why this happened. but it's not a hard fix. All we have to do is select these UV polygons and rotate them. Now you can grab the rotate tool and spin it to your heart's content, but you can't hold shift and snap it to 90 degrees because that would be too easy. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go to this transform tab over here in the far bottom right corner, and I'm going to enter in 90 degrees right there on the rotate and then hit apply. Sweet. So that's not looking too bad, although I think the logo is a little big. It's wrapping so far sort of from side to side, it would be pretty challenging to read this logo. So what I want to do is, I could either scale this here. Oops. I could try to scale my UVs and see if I can get this to size a little bit better, but we're actually going to notice that if I come around to the back here, because I've exceeded my gray little box here, it's going to be hard to tell, but freeze frame it on YouTube if you need to. You can tell that I've gone outside my boundaries, and this texture is actually looping and wrapping around and coming back out the sides because I've exceeded my boundaries. So I want to undo that and actually just scale it in Photoshop. So I'm going to jump back to Photoshop here and edit this layer and scale it down maybe, like, I don't know, 60% or so, just kind of guessing. Accept that. I'll save my PSD, and then all I have to do is just save out and overwrite my PNG in my case. Click yes. I want to replace it. And then in Cinema here, you don't have to re-import it. You just have to open up your material and click the little thumbnail to go into the texture, and then there's a reload button. So if I click reload, it will update, and I can see that I'm going to need to scale it quite a bit more. So let's try that. Save the Photoshop file. Re-export it. I know it's a little tedious, but this is basically the whole process. We're so close to the end, I promise. Reload that again. So that's not looking too bad now. It's to the point to where you can see basically, you'll be able to read the whole logo all on the front of the bottle. So I'm cool with that. I can always add like a nutritional label and the little disclaimer, the fluid ounce size, whatever, you know, to kind of dress up this image and make it look a little bit more realistic, like it is a bottle label. So on, see if we can zoom in. Nope, not on that one. Well, I think you guys get the point. This one might not be too bad. So there's like extra little doodads that say stuff. Cool. I'll go and do that on my own time in Photoshop and sort of update you guys on what I do there. But that's basically UV mapping. The process for the can is going to be the same process, because at least you know, a can and a bottle, they are essentially the same cylindrical shape, and you're applying the logo onto just a portion of the can. So if I go back to my standard layout and I turn back on my can and move that just to demonstrate, right? We have this same strip here in the middle of the can. You would follow this exact same set of steps. You know, make a copy of it, make it editable, go into the UV viewport, scale, do all that fun stuff, you know, get your Photoshop file. All the same rules apply to the can. The last thing to kind of make this look somewhat bottle-like is going to be making ourselves a glass material instead of this plain white, which is currently applied to the bottle. So we can just make a new material. We'll call this bottle glass. So it's pretty simple. All we want to do is add transparency. So we'll check that on. And this little preview here doesn't look very glass-like. And the reason for that is there's this button right here called refraction, which has a value of 1. And I think I mentioned this at some point in another lesson, but what we really want to do here is we want to set this refraction value to kind of what the real world equivalent value is. And so kind of what this is, or what this term is, if you care to Google it, it's called index of refraction. And this is a scientific thing. I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page. Yep. So what index of refraction is it's the actual phenomena of when you're looking through a surface and you can tell that the image is being distorted because the light, what you're seeing, is going into that surface and it's being shaped or bent. If you've ever looked into like a swimming pool, from like what is index?
I'm just wondering who's sitting here going.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, we just had our definitions test, so I think this was on it. Was it?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Last time it wasn't. Or either that or we did the test later. I can't remember. Anyway, I'll just quit rambling. So if you want to Google what index of refraction for glass is, you can go ahead and do that. But I can just tell you that the value is somewhere between 1.5 and 1.6. So I'm going to type in 1.55, just kind of split the difference. And now this little shader preview looks a little bit more kind of glass-like. It looks sort of like a snow globe, kind of, or a crystal ball. So I'm going to replace that checkered material on my bottle with the glass. And how I mean that specifically is I'm dragging the glass material and replacing that checkered ball right there. And we'll see if we turn off the display line mode that we now have a clear bottled image and we have our logo. Logo kind of looks like crap because it probably should be a little bit shorter, but well, we'll worry about that another day, I think. I think that'll be a good place to wrap it. I know that there are still a couple people finishing up the last assignment. Definitely try to get that in so that you don't shortchange yourself on how much time you spend on this assignment. If you are already beginning on your bottle or product scene, cool, keep going. Dive into some UV mapping today here for the rest of class. And then we're going to start off with the lighting and some of the other stuff on next class. So that'll be it for this lecture. I know it's kind of a tedious process, so I want to keep this on the shorter side. We're only at about a half an hour, so